Today we're going to talk about Greek philosophers, some of the main ones, what their accomplishments were, and their importance to history. Starting off with Pythagoras, who's a little bit of a mystery. We don't have any actual writings from Pythagoras, but several ideas are accredited to him, most notably the Pythagorean theorem, the relationship between the hypotenuse of a right triangle and its other sides. While he wasn't the first person to think of this and see the relationship, supposedly he's the first one to create a proof to illustrate why this is correct. The a squared plus b squared equals c squared. He also famously realized the relationship between sound musical notes, essentially, and math, meaning that he figured out a string of a certain length and a certain width would make a certain sound, musical sound we would say, every time it feels the exact same length. So you could construct an instrument like a violin or something by changing the length of strings or the thickness of strings, and you could control it. It wasn't random, the sounds. We could produce the sounds we wanted to if we simply just solved the math that required to what size string made what sound. But we really don't know if the things accredited to Pythagoras were things that he actually did, or if he was merely getting credit for other people's work. So he's a little bit of an enigma. Socrates, easily one of the most famous philosophers of ancient Greece, if not period. The Socratic method, which you might as well, or very well might have used in class, comes from him and is named after him. He taught using questions, asking a question, breaking a question into smaller kind of sub-questions and answering those individually to answer the larger question as a whole. The modern-day scientific method is kind of based on this, having your hypotenuse and your initial data and then analyzing the data and so on, breaking it up in individual parts to let you see the answer as a whole more clearly. He was focused more on the morality of man, moral issues, right from wrong, and didn't really delve into science or math as some of his contemporaries and those who came after did. So he was very, very influential in establishing this kind of process of questioning the world around you. And a student of his most famous student, Plato, is going to continue that tradition. In fact, basically all we know about Socrates is because Plato wrote down some of his lessons. So what Plato was known for, also asking questions, but essentially he believed that you couldn't find answers in a material world. You couldn't find answers through your senses. That you basically had to find answers to questions abstractly up in your brain. Okay, that's where reason was, because your other senses could be wrong and they could be deceived. And he is going to found the world's first university called the Academy. And the Academy became so famous that we use the term an academy as a school. It's a synonymous word. If you go to an academy, you go to a school. Well, it's because the first university on earth that we know of was founded by Plato. He called it the Academy. His most famous writing was called The Republic, in which he detailed his thoughts on a perfect society, on government, on the necessity of justice to a person's happiness and to the happiness of a society. He didn't write about the republican governmental system, like having an elected leader from the people, anything like that. In fact, according to Plato, the greatest government system consisted of philosopher kings, he called it. Basically, the best and the brightest are the ones who are in charge because they're going to make the best decisions. So he actually wasn't a fan of democracy or republicanism. He thought more of a dictatorship by the right person was the best way to go. The ancient side of the Academy, the ruins of it right there. And one of his most famous parables was the allegory of the cave, to illustrate his ideas about the senses deceiving. Essentially, he said if you chained a bunch of people their whole lives facing the back of a wall, and you had a fire behind them that created shadows on the wall, and that's all they ever saw their whole life were these shadows on the wall. They would see that as their reality. Their senses would see this as reality, but it would be lying to them because we know it's not reality. And if one of these prisoners was set free, kind of a metaphor for setting yourself free and venturing into the reason of your mind and go out into the sunlight, then you would actually experience truth. You would see the world as it really is in the abstract world, because the senses had been lying to you this whole time. Continuing on the kind of tradition, you have Socrates, who taught Plato, and Plato is going to teach Aristotle. Aristotle became very, very famous in his own right. He, of course, agreed a lot with Plato, but his belief was, no, you can find truth in the natural world, in the material world. And whereas Socrates was focused mainly on ethics, and Plato mostly on reason and justice and governments, Aristotle basically studied everything. He wanted to explain basically everything: biology, astronomy, government, art, ethics. He's considered by many the world's first true scientist, and that he just was so fascinated with everything. And we have our science, to thank for him for kind of getting the process of examination of the natural world going. So he is going to become famous for his own writings, and to continue the lineage, he is going to be the teacher of Alexander the Great. And we'll talk more about Alexander the Great later, who is going to go on to conquer the world's largest empire at the time. So Alexander the Great had the ideas of Aristotle and Plato and Socrates in his head when he was conquering the world and spreading those ideas as he went. Couple other famous and influential philosophers. You have Euclid, who was a mathematician who lived in Alexandria, Egypt. That area was conquered by Alexander the Great and was under the control of Greece at the time he lived there. So even though he's living in Egypt, he was of Greek ancestry. And he's the father of geometry. He's going to write a book called The Elements, in which he does various proofs, theories. He basically creates geometry, and his book, the Elements, was the textbook of geometry that basically everyone used all the way through the early 1900s. So if you would have gone to school in Iowa in 1905, you would have used his book, The Elements, written 2,000 years almost before that, as your textbook. So his ideas were so influential, they remained essentially unchanged for thousands of years. So very, very important in the world of mathematics. And finally, we have Archimedes. Archimedes was just truly extraordinary. He arguably could be the most brilliant person who ever lived. The things that he thought of, the things that he created, the ideas behind leverage, parabolas, proving many of other mathematical ideas, engineering, physics. The Archimedes screw is one of his most famous inventions that we still use today, of having this screw that brings up water in a very, very efficient manner, and some third world countries essentially use it exactly as he designed it, completely unchanged, still to this day. So very, very influential. Figuring out the relationship of volume to surface area of spheres. Figuring out how you can use pulleys and leverage to lift large amounts of weight. He famously said, "Give me a point to stand, and I could move the world." Basically, if there was some place he could get leverage on, he could move the earth, because you can move a much, much heavier object with less force with this concept of leverage. So those are some of the most famous Greek philosophers. Please make sure you're writing these down in Cornell notes.